All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual summit presentation, The Promise and Peril of Developmental Education Reform. My name is Kate Wise, and I'm an educational courseware specialist here at Hawks Learning. And our speaker today is Dr. Hunter Boylan. In a career that has spanned over 40 years, Dr. Boylan has worked with street gangs, taught developmental courses, directed a learning center, coordinated academic advising and tutoring programs, coordinated Appalachian State University's graduate program in developmental education, worked with TRIO programs, directed the nation's first doctoral program in developmental education at Grambling State University, directed the Kellogg Institute, and served as director of the National Center for Developmental Education at Appalachian State University. He has authored or co-authored 7 books, 116 articles and monographs, and delivered over 300 presentations at regional, national, and international conferences. He serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Developmental Education and the Journal of College Reading and Learning. He is the founder and former editor of Research in Developmental Education, the principal investigator for the ongoing National Study of Developmental Education, chaired the International Conference on Research and Access in Developmental Education in San Juan, Puerto Rico, is a past president of NADE, and was one of the founders and past chairs of the Council of Learning Assistants in Developmental Education Association. We are so excited to have you here with us today. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter those into the Q&A box located at the panel at the top or bottom of your screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. On that note, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to all of you out there for joining us. The title of my presentation today is, as you see, The Promise and Peril of Developmental Education Reform. And I have 3 objectives for this time period. 1, I want to talk about the good news and the bad news about reform in developmental education. I'd like to look at some of the data surrounding the reforms and review some of the strengths and weaknesses of those reforms. Before I do that, however, I want you to think about 4 statements, and you can write them down or consult your handouts or the slide rather, and decide whether or not you think they're true or not. Let me read them to you. The first statement is, remedial courses are a major cause of low college completion rates. The second statement is, high school grades are one of the best single measures of students' potential for college success. High school grades are one of the best single measures of students' potential for college success. The third, the weakest students are particularly successful using the Emporium model for math instruction. The weakest students are particularly successful using the Emporium model for math instruction. And finally, high school transition courses improve students' college grades. Think about these, ask yourself whether they're true or false, and the answer will be disclosed during this presentation. So let's move on to talking about reform. The good news about reform is that, as a matter of fact, many of these reforms actually work better than what we've been doing in the past. A lot of people are saying that, and that's a true statement. Another piece of good news is the reform movement has drawn a substantial amount of attention to community colleges, attention that our community colleges need. And third, and something a lot of us might not realize, is that there's a great deal of research being done on these reform activities, and we're learning quite a bit about our students and our programs and our ways of teaching from that research. Now, the bad news about reform is that some reform efforts don't really work any better than what we've been doing. Secondly, almost all of these reforms require appropriate training to implement properly. Third, the reforms often represent unfunded mandates that have been dictated by legislators or policymakers. and we're all familiar with unfunded mandates. They're a drain on our resources, our systems, our time, and our energy. And reform implementation may violate academic freedom, and let me explain that. When a state legislature or a state policy-making body can tell you how to teach your English course or your math course, that really is a violation of your academic freedom. Now, they can encourage you to teach it in certain ways. They can advise you. They can provide resources, training, and support. But I think they're going too far when they say, this is how you will teach your courses. And that's one of my concerns about this. What happens next time state legislators or policymakers get an idea into their heads, however good it might be, about what you should be doing? Now, today, we're going to look at the following 4 reforms. One is co-requisite remediation. One is multiple measures. One is the Emporium model. And I also put / modularization because the modularization of the course material is an important part of that. And college transition courses. And this latter are courses taught in the high schools designed to help students do a better job in college. So let's start with co-requisites. The co-requisite movement began at the Community College of Baltimore County with the work of Peter Adams and his associates there. And they came up with a model that had the following features. It had English classes that had a limit of 20 students, 8 of whom had demonstrated themselves to be underprepared for the college English. All 20 students took a regular writing course, college level writing course, plus a 3-hour embedded remedial course. So for the underprepared students, that was 6 hours. And only the 8 underprepared students had to take the extra 3 hours. Another feature of the accelerated learning program was that both the college level and the remedial writing course were taught to the same instructor. Now that's the original model. And if you want to look at pure co-requisites, that's the pure and the original co-requisite. Now, the RAND Foundation, RAND Corporation, has studied what's been going on in Texas primarily, but also other states, and to see what people are doing in the name of co-requisite remediation. And they've named the following things that people are doing to supposedly provide co-requisite remediation students. One is the paired course, which is a good idea. Pairing a reading and study skills course with a math course is certainly a decent idea. It's not exactly co-requisite remediation, but it's also not a bad idea. Another is to extend instructional time. Well, that's what the original ALP did. It put 3 more hours of time into the student schedule. A third is people who are actually implementing the original accelerated learning program model. A fourth is to integrate academic support into co-requisite courses. Now, this can be embedded tutoring, it can be embedded counseling and advising, it can be any number of services which are built into the structure of the course. And finally, there's the technology mediated model. And in this one, you add a computer lab and a certain number of hours in the computer lab onto the co-requisite course, onto the college level course. So essentially, when you talk about co-requisites, these are the models that people are looking at. And so it's difficult to assess co-requisites in some places because you're never sure exactly what model the particular college or university or program is using. And while the data is generally good, I think we need to fine-tune our studies more so we can determine which one of these many models of co-requisite mediation has the best impact on our students. Now, co-requisites are a good idea because they have a number of potential advantages. For instance, they might reduce the amount of time spent in remediation by combining the remedial and the college level courses. So instead of taking 2 different courses, you only have to take 1. And that's certainly an advantage for our students. I think the data is pretty convincing that co-requisite courses can improve pass rates in college level courses. And finally, the data is pretty good that co-requisites can improve the likelihood that students will take the next level college course. It's been an article of faith among people who teach mathematics for as long as I can remember that the best time to take the college level course is right after you've taken the pre-college level course. The best time to take Algebra 2 is right after you take Algebra 1. Well, apparently co-requisites contribute to taking the next level college course. As you know, one of our problems is that many students never even bother to take that college level math course until late in their academic careers. On the other hand, however, a lot of colleges are using untested variants that we've just discussed and calling them co-requisites. Also, without really being well trained, it's easy to implement these courses poorly. One of my consulting maxims is that it's easy to do any good thing badly. And I'm afraid that many of these reforms, and particularly co-requisite remediation, has been put into place, and in many institutions, the appropriate training to make them work isn't taking place. And there's also some evidence that co-requisite courses may not adequately prepare students for the next level college courses in that subject area. But since we don't know which of the models of co-requisites we're talking about, it's hard to tell exactly why that takes place. So let's look at the data about co-requisite courses. What does the data tell us? And the data is pretty good. One of the earlier studies was at Ivy Tech, and they found that pass rates for remedial courses improved from 9% to 50%, and from 25 to 50% in English courses. And they were using a variation that's very close to the ALP to get these. In 2014, researchers found that course grades from college algebra were much higher in the co-requisite sections. This was a comparison study that looked at co-requisite college algebra along with students who had taken the traditional combination of remediation, later followed by college algebra. And most recent study, one of the most recent studies by Ran and Lin, shows that students who were taking co-requisite math and English were somewhere between 15 and 13% more likely to pass the co-requisite course. So I think the data is pretty clear that doing a co-requisite course properly is going to improve student performance in a lot of ways. Let's look at some more. Students who originally placed into the remedial course but took the co-requisite course were as likely to pass the next college level course as those who didn't need remediation at all. Interestingly enough, however, in the most recent study from the community from Harvard's University by Kane and Boatman et al., they found that co-requisite participation, while it had benefits, had little to no effect on retention, on graduation, or transfer. It also had little effect on whether or not students completed college. So one of the true or false items I asked you to think about was whether remedial courses contribute to college dropouts, failure to complete. Our most recent research, and I quote, says that the impact of remediation on college completion has been vastly overrated. In other words, it does not contribute to failure to complete. It may contribute to other things. It may have other problems, but keeping students from graduating is not one of them. Now, getting back to co-requisite remediation, its purpose, I don't think, was designed to get people to graduate in a more timely manner or to get more people to graduate. Its purpose was to improve student skills and to get them to pass the college level courses. And I think the data suggests that that has actually been done pretty well. Let's look at the Emporium model. The Emporium model does two things. Well, it does several things, actually. First, it breaks the course content down into separate modules, and students progress through these modules through mastery testing. And generally, the criteria for mastery is set at about 80%. So a student has to master 80% of one module in order to pass on to the next. Secondly, it uses technology to present the material. In the Emporium model, you don't really need an instructor standing in front of a class. Also, in the original Emporium model, it has both well-trained and immediate help available for students who are having any difficulty working their way through any of the modules, doing the activities in the workbooks, or using the technology. I think what we forget sometimes when we put things online or we require students to use a particular computer program, that many of our students don't know how to do this. And so it requires somebody there to help them, to help students actually use the computer programming. And the Emporium model also requires that students participate in these technology-supported labs. In fact, the labs that's supported by technology is the major delivery method. So what are the possibilities for this? Why do people think this is an important contribution? Well, first of all, the modularization that's typically used allows students to skip material they already know. It enables them to do this by providing mastery testing. The data that comes out of Carroll Twigg Center suggests that the Emporium model saves money for the college. And there is data that says it does indeed do that. After all, it's cheaper to pay a lab assistant than it is to pay a professor to teach the courses. And that in my experience, either the modular method by itself with mastery learning or the Emporium model or a combination of both is very likely to improve student pass rates in the courses where it's used. Now, are there any problems? Yes. One is that many students never complete any of the modules. Pat Cross once said, if you ask developmental students to select their own pace for moving through materials, they'll invariably select the 0 pace. So when you give students the option to complete something or to work through at their own pace, it generally doesn't work very well. And my advice to you, if you're doing this, was don't give them that option. Demand that they maintain some sort of a pace to complete their work. The Emporium model also requires a lot of human support. It requires people in the laboratories who are able to respond to student questions immediately. I think that's one of the keys. You have to give immediate support to students who are having questions or problems before they lose interest, before they forget what the problem was. The support has to be immediate. The other part of that is that the support has to be well trained. The people who provide it have to be knowledgeable about both the math and the English concept involved, as well as the software that students are using, as well as the hardware used to present it. So it takes people who are both well trained in the technology as well as the material to provide that technical support. Originally, the Emporium model, as many of you know, was pioneered at Virginia Tech and the University of Alabama. And these are both selective institutions. And so it's a little bit easier to find people who have both the technical skill and the content skill at a large selective university than it is in a medium-sized community college. So that's a potential problem. And finally, we're learning from recent research that many students simply don't profit from it. And we'll talk more about that later. So what are the results we have so far about Emporium modular courses? Well, according to Carol Twigg and her researchers, the pass rates in remedial math improved by 51% and 25% in English and 25% in college level math. So these, the model does appear to improve pass rates in their courses. In intermediate algebra, the pass rates improved from 59% to 75%. And these were at community colleges in Tennessee, I believe. She also found that the use of the Emporium model reduced instructional costs by about 30%. Now, what we've recently learned from a couple of studies that came out last summer was that most of the gains that people obtain from the Emporium model come because the good students do better. They found in these recent studies that the weakest students do not show much gain from the Emporium model. Most of its success has been with students on the higher end of the skill spectrum. And this, of course, is a limitation for those of us concerned with our weakest students. So while I wouldn't argue against using the Emporium model, I also wouldn't use it if I had a lot of very underprepared students I'm expecting it to help. Let's take a look at multiple measures. I was always taught, both as a graduate and undergraduate, that multiple meant many, meant more than one. And unfortunately, the multiple measures movement has tended to focus on a single measure, that's college grades. I'm sorry, high school grades. And people argue that high school grades are really a multiple measure. It theoretically measures such things as attendance, perseverance, academic skill, etc. I'm still waiting for the data to corroborate that, but it's a good idea. Multiple measures implies the use of several measures, but in practice, many institutions only use high school grades. And so that's the only measure we're getting on student performance. Now, once you use them, and basically we're talking about multiple measures for placement purposes. And the data is pretty clear that high school grades are a better measure than our traditional assessment instruments. And it's also been pretty clear that we have traditionally placed too many students in remedial courses. One of the mistakes we have made over decades has been that we have placed students in remediation who probably could survive and prosper in the college level course. And so high school grades can be used to exempt students from remedial courses. And that's typically how they're used. So that given a GPA that somebody establishes, students above that can be placed directly into college courses. I think those people who started off thinking the 2.5 was the correct GPA to exempt people from remediation have found that it probably should be a little bit higher than that. 2.6, 2.7, 2.75 might be better cutoff scores. Now, among the possibilities as to why this could be a very beneficial change in the way we do business is that the use of multiple measures improves the accuracy of placement. I don't think there's any question about that. The more measures you have that determine a student's skill set, the more likely you are to make intelligent and accurate decisions about placing that student in courses and programs. Also, the use of multiple measures reduces the number of students improperly placed in remedial courses. And that's a very important thing because we're costing students time and money when we unnecessarily place them in a course they don't need. The use of multiple measures may also improve the quality of information available to advisors. And as my introduction pointed out, I used to run an academic advising program. And our problem for all of our advisors was we did not have enough information. We wish we had more information to make decisions about what courses and programs students would engage in. So, what are some of the perils of this? Well, as I think we all know, high school grades are not the only true measure of a student's readiness for college. There are other measures. And I'm afraid that the multiple measures movement and the use of high school grades in that movement overlooks a lot of the non-cognitive aspects of studenthood. So it tends to miss things like students' attitude towards learning, their willingness to seek help, their perseverance. Excuse me, I apologize for that. Well, that should settle them. Besides, it's probably someone who just wanted to sell me something. That's what most of you get, isn't it? In any event, the use of multiple measures, a downside of it is it's a little bit more expensive than other forms of measurement. In fact, Barnett and all his colleagues suggested it probably cost about $110 more per student. And that, I think, has to do with the cost of getting high school transcripts and analyzing them. Of course, the problem with that is that high school transcripts aren't available for all students. Many students' high school transcripts are 10, 20 years old. There are lots of reasons why you can't get a high school transcript. So it's probably a good idea to have a backup plan. Now, insofar as high school grades and placement results, they do. I think it's very clear, and Junkus College provided a lot of good information to support this, that high school grades provide more accurate placement than our traditional placement instruments. Interestingly enough, those instruments, like the ACT or the SAT, were originally called aptitude tests, which implies that they measured how well the student's likelihood would be to perform in a certain area, college, for instance. They later changed them to achievement tests, even though they didn't change the questions. And there's a real big difference between aptitude and achievement. Aptitude implies that your score is directly related to how well you will do in the future. Achievement implies that your score represents what you know at this point. So in fact, we've been using achievement measures that say this is what a student knows now. And what we haven't been doing is using those as if they really predicted how well a student should do in college. In fact, they only predict this is what a student now knows. They don't predict what a student will do if they get education or training or support or tutoring or good instruction. I think that's something we need to keep in mind about our assessment systems generally. In any event, according to Junkus and Collins, there were 41.5% more students who placed in the college level courses when high school grades were used as the primary measure for placement. And that means apparently that those students did not have to take an extra college course or spend some extra time taking that course. Now, if those students who were placed at the college level, I think this is somewhat interesting. It's not only get better placement, but somehow contributed to better results. If you placed at the college level in math based on your high school grades, you were 3.1% more likely to complete the course than those who had to go into remediation first. And you're 12.5 more likely to do that in English. So what we're saying here essentially is that if you were exempt from remedial courses, there is some likelihood, particularly if your high school grades show that you should be exempt, there's a likelihood that you'll do better in the college level course than those students who placed into remediation first. Now, let's look at our last one here. College transition courses. Some states have bought into this and some states have never heard of it. But for those of you who are doing it in your state, the college transition course is usually offered in high school, and it's designed by college faculty working in concert with high school faculty. This, by the way, is kind of difficult to pull off. It's hard to get that collaboration going. Secondly, the courses that are designed are targeted students who don't meet college readiness standards. And as you know, there's been a move to assess college readiness during the junior year of high school now, and to attempt to use that senior year to do something about it. College transition courses are an example of one of these attempts. These courses provide basic skills instruction and study skills instruction during the senior year in high school. And typically they involve 2 periods, 1-hour periods a week, devoted to having college material presented to students. Also, there's usually an attempt to provide counseling and advising built into the college transition course so that students have a better idea of how to take advantage of the services available to them once they reach college. At least that's the theory. What are the possibilities? Well, the whole idea here is that if you train a student better in high school, there's a lower probability of that student having to take a remedial course in college. If you don't have to take a remedial course in college, you spend less money on your college experience, and the college spends less money providing that course. And of course, the basis of this is that taking the transition course in high school will improve students' overall readiness to succeed in college level courses. At least that's the theory. Perils. Well, from what I've heard from the high schools that are participating in this, they don't necessarily appreciate being told that they have to provide more courses, more space, and more time for their students, particularly since very few of the state legislators that are mandating this have offered to provide extra funding to support it. As a result of this, inadequate funding might, and I say might because sometimes these are adequately funded. In my opinion, most of the times they're not. There's inadequate resources applied to the task of preparing students for college at the high school level. And frankly, I'm still waiting for the evidence that any of this actually works. So let's take a look at what the evidence does say. It says, well, there's somewhere between a negative or a small improvement in college readiness. In other words, some students don't get any better, some students get a little bit better, and some students actually get worse for some reason. Apparently, high school transition courses have no impact at all on passing the college English course. And you may take the high school transition course, but it doesn't help you get through the college course. There is a slight impact, and it's barely statistically significant, on passing the college level math course. On the other hand, and I don't understand this one, if you look at students' grades, they're more likely to pass, a little bit more likely. On the other hand, their actual knowledge of mathematics declines as a result of the high school transition course. I'm sure somebody would like me to explain that. Unfortunately, I probably can't. So what does all this mean to us? Where do we go from here? And I have a number of suggestions for you before we go back and look at the true-false statements. First, I know we're busy practitioners, and I know most of us don't have time to read and interpret the research, and I'm not asking you to do so. What I'm asking you to do is follow those sources that summarize the research, that do the analysis for you. And I'm going to suggest a few here. I don't know, I wish I have a show of hands. How many of you subscribe to the Lumina Daily News? This comes out, as its title suggests, every day, and it reports on key events, policy decisions, research, outcomes, reforms that are taking place in higher education. And often it discusses in fairly short, cogent paragraphs new studies that are coming out and what those studies tell us. My friend and colleague, Norm Stahl, who chaired the Reading and Literacy program at Northern Illinois Universities for many years and has won many awards for his contributions to the field, every Friday puts out what he calls his Higher Education Digest. And that digest has all sorts of tips, all sorts of references to websites, to reports that are beneficial to the practitioner. And I think probably if you look at it from the practitioner standpoint, Norm's website probably has the information that is most directly relevant to practitioners. And finally, I'd suggest you subscribe to Inside Higher Education News. It's free. All of these things are free, by the way. There's no cost associated with getting on their list. They make their, Lumina just supports that out of foundation funds. Inside Higher Education supports their work with advertising. And so Inside Higher Education also sums up on a daily basis policies taking place in states, what's happening in states, what reforms are going on, what policies are being considered, what research has come out to affect various areas. Now, not all of this is going to apply to your working with underprepared students, but a great deal of it will. And so those are some major sources where you can get the information condensed for you, analyzed for you pretty quickly. And one of the things that's happening as a result of the reform movement, which I have already mentioned, is that we're getting a lot more research on what we're doing from a variety of sources. I mean, the Community College Research Center has been one of the leading research sources. The Rossier Center for Higher Education in California, the Student Success Center at Florida State, the RAND Corporation, the Office of Community College Research and Leadership at the University of Illinois. All of these organizations have put a lot more time into studying how students learn, how to organize support services, what kind of teaching techniques work with them. And so there are a lot of reports, and it's usually pretty good, that can guide our practice, that can inform our decision-making about what we do. Also, oh, by the way, the next slide here talks about diverse issues in higher education. Diverse higher education is also a source of new research, and it's particularly relevant to us because much of the research and much of the discussions of policy issues have to do with students of color in colleges and universities, students and faculty of color in colleges and universities. So I particularly recommend this site because students of color represent a very large portion of the developmental education and learning center population. And they too report on research relevant to these populations and are particularly interested in issues affecting our students of minority ethnic backgrounds. Second thing I would do would be to scribe to your professional journals. If you're an academic advisor, you should apply to the college journal. If you're teaching college reading, if you run a learning center, you subscribe to the journal of college reading and learning. If you're teaching in a developmental class or a co-requisite class or working in a learning center, you should subscribe to the Journal of Developmental Education. If you're an English instructor, you should be subscribing to the English journals. So if you're teaching math, you should be involved in the math professional associations and should be learning what they're doing and what they're saying. These are the places where you get the most current information and the best ideas and the best information about what works and what doesn't work and how well it works, and to some extent for whom. The other thing I would suggest is that after you sorted through some of these sources and found particularly interesting articles, share those with your leadership. In most places, and I'll admit there are a few where this might not work, you don't get into trouble by just sharing information with your administrators. You get into trouble by telling them what to do. And so I would suggest that when you find something that says, here are 4 ways to do co-requisite remediation, and here are the top 1 or 2 of those 4, your administrators need to know these things. They need to know what the research is saying about reform. Because in my opinion, that not all reform is going the way it should, and not all reform is getting us where we hope we should be going. It's not that the reforms themselves are bad, it's that we choose to implement them poorly. We choose to under-resource them. We choose to understaff them. And because we've made those decisions, the reform movement may not attain its potential. So by keeping abreast of the research, we can find information that will be useful to share with our administrators and hopefully guide them in their policymaking. Now, let me go back to the beginning here. I had 4 questions, true or false. The most recent research by Kane, Boatman et al., coming out of Harvard, says that remedial courses do not cause low college completion rates, which has been an article of faith in the media that, after all, remediation causes attrition. Apparently, it's not a major cause of attrition. Other things cause attrition, and we need to address those other things. We need to address those other things, rather. Among the things that are most likely to be associated with students dropping out are being a first-generation college student, being a low-income college student, coming into education from minority backgrounds. I think Jim Sedlicek has talked about this in his research in the University of Maryland, that minority students who are best capable of dealing with racism are also more likely to graduate, are also more likely to be successful. So there are certain non-cognitive things that we need to address. That has to do with income, status, social status, first-generation college status. and factors like that which do require addressing. This statement here is true. High school grades are one of the best single measures of students' potential for college success. And if you do nothing else but look at college grades, you'll make better placement decisions than you will doing anything else, except using many measures. The weakest students are particularly successful using the Emporium model for math instruction. That is not true. In fact, it's the strongest students who are particularly successful using the Emporium model. So we're not necessarily going to strengthen our weakest students' performance in math by using that model. I'm not encouraging not to use it so much as I'm saying understand what you're getting when you do use it. And finally, there's the notion that high school transition courses improve students' college grades. By and large, they don't. They don't contribute very much to improve students' grades in college. There may be other advantages to them which we have yet to discover, but if we're teaching these transition courses for the purpose of improving students' college grades, we're not going to get what we're planning to get. Now, having said that, and those are my prepared comments, I'd like to devote some time to answering whatever questions may have come up during our discussion so far this afternoon. Kate, you want to take that away for?
Yes. Okay, so I do have a question from Lisa Mott. She says, from what was presented, it seems the most evidence-based data points to using the high school GPA or multiple measures approach, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
I'm disappointed that people aren't using other measures. For instance, we ought to be asking students questions before we place them in a course. Questions like, how many hours a week do you work? Do you have adult responsibilities? Are you taking care of parents or children? Do you have reliable transportation to college? Are you secure in having a place to live? Are you food insecure? I mean, the research tells us that about 1 out of 5 college students is food insecure. About the same number don't have housing. So I think high school GPA is probably the single best individual measure. But I also think we need to be finding more about our students and the circumstances which they live.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, do you have the title of the Kane article readily available?
It should be on your handout sheets. I'm not sure how Hawks decided to handle the handout sheet. You know that, Kate?
We'll make sure that if you haven't gotten an email ahead of time with the handout, then we'll make sure that you have that after to reference, and we'll also be willing to share that directly afterwards. We do have a couple of other questions that have come in through the question and answer, and everyone else can continue entering those in. But I do have a question from Michelle Pearson. What is your view on using contextualized thematic-based reading materials for a developmental reading course, especially with regard to including reading materials that are linked to introductory level college courses?
Well, that sounds like a question that would come out of my doctoral dissertation defense. By the time you get to the end of it, I've forgotten what the question is. Would you mind repeating?
Do you want me to reread it?
Please.
Yes. What is your view on using contextualized thematic-based reading materials for a developmental reading course?
Okay, if you stop there, my answer is I'm all in favor of it. Say, if you're fortunate enough to still be teaching reading, that's probably one of the better approaches you can use. And I would definitely support that as a technique for teaching reading. Was there a second?
Okay, perfect. She just said, especially with regard to including reading materials that are linked to introductory level college courses. So probably referring specifically to co-requisite courses.
Definitely. The contextual and thematic part of it, I think, are essential for good reading instruction. And that's particularly
Okay.
since we're now having a lot of integrated reading and writing courses,
Hmm.
and you're not getting putting as much time into reading as you used to. And so you have
Hmm.
bang from your buck out of the reading activities you do engage in. So I think it's
Hmm.
really important right now.
Okay. Kind of spinning off of that, there's a question, do you think standalone reading classes should continue to exist?
Do I think standalone reading classes should what?
Continue to exist.
That's a good question, because it causes me to rethink a lot of things.
Mhm.
I am not a fan of standalone reading courses. On the other hand, I believe there are some students who, in our system, particularly in our community colleges, whose reading skills are so weak that it takes an entire course to resolve their problems. And so and this may be old-fashioned of me, but I would still keep the standalone reading courses around, because some of our students simply read so poorly that they need the entire semester, the entire 16 weeks, the entire time that could be devoted to teaching reading. I emphasize reading here, not study skills, not college orientation, but reading. And if you're actually teaching reading in a standalone reading course for our weakest students, then Hunter Boylan is not going to find fault with that. On the other hand, in general, I'm not a fan of the standalone reading course.
Okay. Again, kind of tied to this question, Teresa says, I oversee a shrinking number of reading instructors who are frantically job hunting. Do you have advice as they and I recreate ourselves?
First of all, I'm sorry you're experiencing that. I think it's a huge mistake that we're making in our colleges. Is there anybody on your campus who thinks that reading isn't important to success in college? And yet, one of the things we're doing, even knowing that, is cutting back on college reading positions. I think that I would gather all the information I can about the benefits of reading and the benefits of having somebody who's actually prepared to teach reading through a graduate program doing the teaching. And I'm sure you've probably done this, but I would say gather even more information. It's out there. And put this together in a package, share that with your administrators, but also, if you're going to lose your job anyhow, you may as well share it with the press. You may as well write a letter to the editor. You may as well talk to political figures. You may explain to the people who are making the decisions why these decisions are bad. As I said, if they're going to fire you anyhow, you got nothing to lose by holding a press conference. On the other hand, holding a press conference criticizing your administrators is an excellent way to get fired if you're not planning on leaving. The other thing I would do is try to work through the International Literacy Association, formerly IRA. They are the biggest game in town, and unfortunately, they've pretty much abandoned college reading. There was a college reading spin at one time, and I think that's where you get support professionally from the International Literacy Association and from the people who are still there involved in college reading and literacy. So I would strengthen links with the ILA and encourage the ILA leadership to address this issue. I say this is a very serious problem. Reading has not improved among entering college students, and yet we're abandoning efforts to teach them to read, and we're assuming it'll come from integrating some reading activities into other courses. And for your better students, it will. But I don't believe it'll help your weaker students. And so I would try to find allies, particularly in professional associations, to try to help fight this.
Okay. I have another question from Lisa Pope. Are you a proponent of, oh, and Teresa says thank you. Are you a proponent of mandatory tutoring for remedial students? What role should tutoring play in support courses?
I'm a proponent of mandatory tutoring for remedial, underprepared developmental students. Number one, even making it mandatory is not going to ensure that students take advantage of it. We have a lot of people slipping through the cracks of our mandatory systems. Making it mandatory at least ensures that they will go someplace and get some help. But if you're going to make it mandatory, I would also look at incentivizing participation. What can we give students that would be of value to them if they participate? Ideally, we give them a reserved parking spot on campus. Since we probably can't do that, I think of other possible incentives. Credit in the course they're taking, credits at the bookstore, credits at the cafeteria, some way of rewarding participation in mandatory tutoring. But if the answer is, am I a proponent of it? The answer is yes. I would just say that we have to do a better job of, one, communicating with our students what mandatory means, getting there to tutoring, and incentivizing the behavior of attending tutoring.
Okay. The next question is from Catherine Bankston, asking or saying some colleges are going to 8-week classes. How will that affect Dev Ed courses?
Okay. There actually is a modest amount of research on the length of what they call compressed classes. And it appears to be that for a certain percentage of the students, I don't know what it is, it could be half, it could be 60%, it could be 30%. The best period of compression is 8 weeks. If you go below 8 weeks, you're probably not going to get the results you want. If you go beyond 8 weeks, then what's the point? And so what research suggests that if you're going to use compressed courses, 8 weeks is about the best time. Now, I guess that's already given in her situation, if I understand the question. Since you have a compressed amount of time, once again, you have to do everything possible to make sure that students actually participate in the time available. And you have to make it engaging, interesting. And unfortunately, you have to probably be a better teacher in an 8-week course than you do in a 16-week course. Now, there's lots of literature available on how to improve your teaching. There's lots of, in many cases, there are centers for academic excellence or teaching improvement centers on campus. If you're going to go to 8 weeks, which is probably going to benefit some students, what I don't know is how many. My guess is it benefits your better students more than your weakest students. Then it's incumbent upon you to provide the best and the most engaging 8-week experience possible. And use the resources on campus to learn how to do that.
Okay, so the next one is similar to a conversation we were just having about reading courses. She says, on February 24th, our integrated reading and writing department was eliminated at Austin Community College. For the last 3 years, we have been teaching INRW courses paired with history, humanities, sociology, government to support the Pathways initiative at our college. We have spent an inordinate amount of time specializing our curriculum for those courses and developing those relationships. Part 2 of the announcement is that moving forward, fall 2020 and beyond, we will not be pairing with any courses outside of English composition. This will eliminate support and the literacy practices in these other disciplines. In the presentation today, there isn't a lot of research on this, so I'm wondering if we should fight this. As a PhD in reading ed, I think we need to keep these pairs to support students who are getting crushed in history in a first-year history class and other courses.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts on that, I guess?
Whenever somebody wants to change a procedure that I don't like, my response is typically, okay, I'm not opposed to the change, but let's collect data to see what the implications of the change are. And so I think it would be a very good idea to look at the course grades in the courses that are supported by your IRW now, and then look at them again next year and the year after. I mean, if we're really serious about completion, if we're really serious about student success, then these are the kind of data points we should be collecting. So if that's the way it's going to be, and without knowing anything more about the situation, I would say I don't see why that's a good decision. But if that's the way it's going to be, then fine, let's try it and see what happens. Those students get better as a result of this change policy. They get worse. And if they get worse, oh, I'd just like to remind you, that was your policy, not mine. So I think when this happens, it's really important to collect data on what happens moving forward so we can show people. Now, if everybody gets better grades and graduates more frequently because they did this, then I'd also back off and not complain. What do I think the likelihood of that happening is? 0.
Yeah,
I think in this
absolutely.
course, the decision's been made. The only thing you can do is gather data about the impact of that decision.
Well, thank you so much. Let's see. Do you have time for one more question and then we'll wrap up?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So this question is, what does the data show about peer support? My school has what we call embedded peer support, i.e. a tutor, with a former successful student who attends 1 hour of the course and then provides additional support outside of the classroom time for a writing conference. For instance, a student sets up a time to meet with the tutor in the library. Interestingly enough, almost no students take that opportunity for additional support, even when they know they need it. Grades, teachers saying, meeting with peer tutor, etc. I think this anecdotal data seems to correlate with what you said today. So what does, from your experience, what does the data show about peer support?
Peer learning as a concept is probably one of the best and most well-researched techniques we have. I would suggest that you look up Dave Arendale, that's A-R-E-N-D-A-L-E, on the internet, and he has posted all sorts of research and best practices and information supporting it. The peer learning movement, as near as I can tell, started off in the 70s, and people have been gathering information on this ever since. And as near as I can tell, it's one of the best single interventions available to provide student support services. So what is my position on it? I think it's great. I also understand when you make appointments with students they don't show, a couple things that might, again, incentivize this. One, I would have all of your peer leaders, peer tutors, whatever you're calling them, give them business cards. And on the back of the business card, you have a space to show when your next appointment is. And you give that to the students and you ask them to treat it just like they would a doctor's appointment. If they can't make it, call you. There's your telephone number. Send you an email, send you a text, which holds students then accountable for being there. used to provide food at everything I sponsored. I know you can't take your cafeteria in the library, but if there are events where your students come, or you're trying to get students to attend, providing a little bit of nourishment is never a bad idea. Having contact with students outside of the peer learning session, just a text. How are you doing this week? Did you have your test in biology yet? Et cetera, et cetera. There's a little bit of research that suggests that if you maintain contact with your students in between tutoring or peer learning sessions, and that contact is directly related to some topic that you're dealing with, students are more likely to participate in the peer learning session. So what that means is, rather than saying, "Hi, Fred, how are you doing this week?" you say, "Hi, Fred, I was wondering if you've been able to apply any of the study skills we talked about last week." Or, "Hi, Fred," or "Hi, Sally. Did you have your math test on Friday? And if so, how'd you do?" The more specific you are to the situation, the more likely students are to respond to you. But just saying, "Hi, how are you doing?" is not enough to get your students to come and see you.
All right. Well, it does look like we're about out of time. So thank you so much, Dr. Boylan, and thank you all for attending today. If you do have any additional questions, please direct them to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we will be emailing you all a link to all sessions at the conclusion of our virtual summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.